Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. I cannot wait to dive very deeply, in fact, into Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. This was one of the most intense reading experiences I have had for a long time. Those of you who have seen this background before on YouTube may notice, in fact, that I've got my Himalayan salt lamp going here, which is kind of a new thing. And the reason I have that is because it promises to reverse all of the ions while I'm talking, which I don't really believe in. But the point of all of that is to say that this book actually made me very superstitious in a very, very powerful way. Sometimes literature does that for me. It seems like something that really can, in fact, decide fates. So I am someone who is flying a lot these days, someone whose children are grown. And at the very beginning of this book, you realize, in fact, that someone gets killed in an Iranian aircraft that gets shot down. So I got very superstitious about it and had this thing of like, I started it and then I had to put it aside. I also would argue that the reading experience was very intense in lots of ways. I'm someone who has a lot of addiction in her family. I think some of that was striking a chord with me. It felt like so incredibly appealing, but at the same time formidable in the sense that I knew it was going to be very intense. I went back to it when I had a little bit more resilience, and I just absolutely cannot get enough of this book. This is one of very few books that I feel like I need to reread right away, only because there is such richness, and also because the ending of the book is ambiguous and enigmatic, and it is one where I believe, and Kaveh Akbar has said this in an interview that I heard, there are lots of breadcrumbs throughout the novel that point you toward, certain endings. I do believe, in fact, that the endings are plural. So I feel like I need to go back and take a good look at how this thing is really structured, and also paying attention to some hints and some signposts and some details along the way that I think would really even enrich further my understanding of the book. So this is a little bit different today. The lecture we will be doing, we're going to dive deep today into the text, but today we won't have any spoilers and I won't talk about the end. I'm going to do a separate installment on the end. This is I'm not someone who loves an ambiguous ending, an open-ended ending, but I truly believe that, and this, I might be totally wrong, but I really believe that Kaveh Akbar has done this incredible thing where you can equally argue two different outcomes, and at least, in fact, like a total plurality of outcomes. But I think there are two kind of major outcomes. And, I spent a lot of time reading reviews, listening to interviews. I got really lost on a Reddit and a subreddit and all sorts of different things, different people's interpretations. And let me tell you, people have strong opinions about the ending of this book. And there are a lot of questions on the internet about what it is that happens at the end of this book. So I'm going to have a separate lecture. In that lecture, we are actually going to look very carefully at the data. So Daniel Mendelsohn is a classics professor and a critic. I love so much of his nonfiction, but I really love this thing that he said, which is that we need to approach fiction much the way that we approach any other social science. And when we are coming up with some sort of a judgment or some sort of interpretation, we really need to be able to back it up with data from the text, and we also need to be sure that there isn't any data that runs contrary to our argument. So in the second installment of this lecture, I am going to look at some of the ways that I think I want to argue the ending, but I'm equally going to weigh some of the, the counter argument. So if you are someone who's interested in how this book ends, and I think there are lots of us out there, I'll be doing a separate thing about that. Okay, here's what we're going to be doing today. We'll talk briefly about why I decided to read the book, go back to it after I got so scared the first time. And then we are going to talk briefly about the biography of Kaveh Akbar. We will then dive in talking about the cover art, the title, and the dedication, the epigraph, and the opening of the novel. We're then going to take a close look at narrative stance. Then we're going to look at the structure. Then we're going to take kind of a quick look at this faith in and preoccupation with language and the way that art in lots of ways can offer immortality and the ways that Akbar is playing with that. More specifically, we'll look a bit at figurative language and this incredible inventiveness, and then we will stop this lecture and we will talk about the ending in the next lecture. So why do I think you should read this book? First of all, it came highly recommended by a very smart reader friend. And it was one of those books that already, and it came out this year in 2024, but it's already being touted as one of the best books of the year. It is a New York Times bestseller, which sometimes is like a detractor for me, but I really was intrigued by the idea that something that is, people are talking about what kind of literary heavyweight it has, but also the fact that it has this broad appeal, which is always very interesting to me. I liked the idea of it as sort of a dude book. So here at the Fox page, on the YouTube, I have a whole separate playlist of dude books, and I really like them. I went through a period of time, maybe in my early 30s, where I was obsessed with postmodernism. Well, I've always really enjoyed reading like very male authors, starting, with Steinbeck or Twain, and then not so much Dickens, but then, moving to Updike and Richard Ford and really sort of diving in then to the postmodern movement. So people like David Foster Wallace, people like Pynchon and Don DeLillo, and I got in this huge William Gaddis kick. So I was really immersed in these very male authors. And I do resist the idea of sort of gendering our reading, but I also really do believe that, at least for me, there are books that feel, like they would appeal to men in specific, and there are also books that I think appeal to women in specific. And I really don't want to reify any categories of sex and gender, but I think these are just sort of realities that I have come to hold. A couple of the dude books that we have looked at here on the Fox page are like Deadwood, for example, and we looked very carefully at the latest Cormac McCarthy. I love Cormac McCarthy. I've read all of his work, even like the really obscure ones, although of course I don't remember them. So I really was interested in this as a dude book and sort of placing it into that context a little bit. We're going to talk today about some of the resonances with David Foster Wallace. In some ways at the beginning, it felt to me like a poor man's infinite jest. Not even like a poor man's infinite jest, but a little. I really very much had in mind infinite jest, and was finding this book wasn't quite measuring up in some ways, but also found that this book in lots of ways surpassed some of the more annoying and more kind of weirdly masculine tropes that you find in postmodernism and certainly in David Foster Wallace. I also like the fact that Kaveh Akbar names Infinite Jest in this novel, because then you get this sense that he understands, clearly he's someone I would almost bet money on the fact that he has read David Foster Wallace and has a certain amount of esteem. Certainly the writing about Sobriety has lots of echoes of David Foster Wallace. So I'm interested in looking at that and was very happy, in fact, that Akbar was kind of upfront about any kind of, echo that I am hearing there. I also was really taken by the cover and the title and just the sort of both the seriousness and the playfulness. We also here at the Fox page haven't read anything by an Iranian writer, and so I was really interested in learning. And in fact, I really did learn a lot. Speaking of diving in, we're going to go ahead and do that. Kaveh Akbar is an Iranian-American poet and now novelist. He was born in Tehran in 1989. When he was 2 years old, his family moved to the United States. He lived in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Indiana. And one of the things that he stresses is the importance, in fact, of the Midwest. There was one very cheeky interview who talked about how this guy was from the Mideast and the Midwest. But the Midwest becomes this very important context. In fact, that is another echo of David Foster Wallace, who situated a lot of his work in the Midwest where he was from. He was from Illinois. So Kaveh Akbar got an undergraduate degree from Purdue, his MFA from Butler, and then a PhD in creative writing from Florida State University. And, this is obviously someone who is incredibly intelligent, but I was not at all surprised to learn that he also has a PhD, that he's someone who's been very, very serious about his academic approach to literature of all stripes. I mean, you imagine there was a lot of poetry, studying that was going on. I don't know what his doctoral dissertation was on, but I do, I can absolutely imagine it was incredible. Somebody should publish that. Okay, he is now the director of the undergraduate, at least according to Wikipedia, the undergraduate program at Iowa. In 2024, He published Martyr. It has become a New York Times bestseller, as I mentioned. 2024 was also a big year for him because he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, or the Goog, as Nicholson Baker likes to refer to it. All sorts of people have just extolled his writing. One person in particular who I really appreciated was Junot Diaz, who called his work incandescent. I love Junot Diaz. In fact, we need to take a look at him here at the Foxed page. But I very much trust his work, and he had a very laudable review of Kaveh Akbar. Kaveh Akbar, is married to Paige Lewis, who is non-binary, and very much is made in this book about our protagonist, Cyrus, as being sort of between categories. And he himself talks about, sort of not fitting into any checked boxes. And a lot is made of him as a bisexual male. I actually really like the portrayal here because it's just part of the background. So this idea we also are going to have to talk here a little bit about the idea of art imitating life and some autobiographical elements that come in. We're not going to lean too heavily into that, but in some different interviews, Kaveh Akbar has spoken about when he immigrated, having immigrated to the United States, to the Midwest, and how that was a very different feeling to be in the Midwest than it was to be, for example, in New York City. He talks a lot about what it is to be sort of the only person who was not white in the classrooms when he was growing up, but also about how there are these very large populations that are different ethnicities in the Midwest, and how his father, for example, when he had a farm job, very much like Ali Shams in the book, that he was there with other people who had emigrated from all over the globe. We're now going to dive into the book. So I was so struck by this cover. And Kaveh Akbar we're going to talk first about the sort of visual effect of the cover. Kaveh Akbar talked about how he got, in fact, to veto several different cover art approaches that had been suggested by his marketing team, and in fact that this was far and away his favorite, and that he really, really appreciates the work and the tone and everything about this cover. I love the empty space here. I love the emphasis on martyr. I love how that really takes our attention at the beginning. And then we have what seems to me here like a very Middle Eastern image. And in fact, it is a very important image once we have read the book. It is someone on horseback with a sword, which is exactly how we come to see Arash when he is riding the horse with his long robes through the field of the dying young men in Iran. So this is a very important image, but what happens in the beginning here is it's cartoon-like enough that it is suggesting something that's not sort of too ominous. I also really like the fact that we have this kind of like dialogue bubble here, and it says a novel, but I think this idea here of this sort of comic book feel is very important. So Kaveh Akbar has talked about how he doesn't want the book to feel too self-important or too self-serious and not too heavy. So it's a very important and very successful, I think, melding of both seriousness and a certain joy and a certain levity. And it is really, really funny in lots of places. So this is the perfect combination in many ways of a little bit of a cartoon feeling, and also not too much. Like it's really giving some space to this idea of martyr, but we have a certain levity that comes with the cover art. I also really love the font. I love everything about this. I love the color. It's really very strong. So I also love the title. One of the most striking things, of course, is that it is called Martyr. And in one of the interviews right away, they asked about the exclamation point. The exclamation point is so important. So he talks about the fact that when he realized the book was about a martyr and was about the concept of martyrdom, he realized that calling a book Martyr and having the title Martyr on the cover of the book along with his name was putting him in a somewhat precarious situation in a country, in fact, that really has deep feelings about these topics. He uses the phrase not inert a lot, and this was one of the times when he used this idea that, a book about martyrdom with martyr on the title, in big letters and with a name that is very identifiably Iranian would in fact, could be in fact very inflammatory in this United States. So he had this idea that he could either euphemize around it. That was his verb, which I love. He could either kind of euphemize endlessly around the concept of the martyr, or he could just say it. And then he realized, in fact, that if he yelled it, that there's a certain levity that comes with it. So exclamation marks, I am guilty of using them a lot in all of my texts. And you all have seen them, in fact, in podcast things, because I have a certain amount of enthusiasm and energy and levity in my approach to literature or communication in general that I hope to convey with all of my exclamation marks. So what he is doing with this title is both focusing our attention really, really squarely on arguably the most important topic in the book, and really pointing this out as a controlling idea that we really need to think about on many, many different levels. But the addition of the exclamation mark is just so good. Again, it's adding levity, but it's also really underscoring the importance and the urgency in the title. The endorsement on the front of the book is by Tommy Orange. In the interviews, we have learned that Kaveh Akbar and Tommy Orange trade pages every Friday, which I just was so happy to have that piece of information. But they read each other's work, and Tommy Orange being, of course, the author, the highly esteemed and really, I think, very deservedly so, the author of They're There and Wandering Stars. And Wandering Stars and Martyr were coming out about the same time. And there, in the interviews, a decent amount is made of the fact that both of them, their process was to write long. So they would write and write and write. And then together would really sort of distill things back down to really what is the essential. So Kaveh Akbar has talked about the fact that this feels like a fairly slim novel. He said it's like 310 pages or something, but I think it's actually 331 by my count. It's 332. But the reason why he sees it as a slim novel, which is ironic because, as a poet, he would be publishing, and he has published very important work in very slim chapbooks or very small collections, just the nature of what it is to write poetry. But this book he also sees as slim, in part because he wrote so much more than what is included in the ultimate product. So we have in the dedication here, I love this dedication so much. It simply says, well, not even simply, it's a very broad and really compassionate and interesting dedication. It says, for the martyrs who live. So right from the beginning, I have to say there's a certain amount of ambiguity about martyrdom and the idea of either choosing a death, which is a sort of martyrdom, or rejecting the idea of death in favor of life. So right at the beginning, we have this tension between the idea of a death that is a martyr's death or choosing life. We go on, and we have this epigraph, which is actually, it doesn't feel quite like an epigraph because we have this beautiful little sun kind of star/flower design that we have often repeated throughout these pages. And under it, so it sort of feels like it's part of the book. And this is a book that really involves a lot of poetry and a lot of different texts. In some ways, it's a compendium of the work of Cyrus Shams and the work of Kaveh Akbar, but also of many different poets and many different voices. Clarice Lispector is she is a Brazilian writer, just an absolutely incredible writer. And we begin with one of her lines, and then the book actually ends with a slightly longer version of this same quotation. So the quotation is this: "My God, I just remembered that we die." There is so much here we're not going to dig into deeply, but you do have this sense of understanding the gravity of death, but also what has happened here is she has forgotten. I mean, the idea of I just remembered, really inherent in that is the idea that sometimes we can forget. Cyrus Shams is not someone, in fact, who often forgets the idea that we die. It's also important that Clarice Lispector, who is Brazilian, so who may or may not be Catholic, but certainly has a lot of context for Catholicism, is beginning that phrase with "my God," and it's a capitalized G, sort of Judeo-Christian God. "My God, I just remembered that we die." So we have this idea of this question of a religious martyrdom. I mean, she's not necessarily talking about martyrdom. She's, in fact, just talking about the fact that, as humans, we all share the human condition, which is that we will all die. And in this case, God is, the idea of a religious context is important for her. So then we dive into the actual text. So I love the fact that Akbar is very generous with us in that he is giving us the name of the narrator. This is actually a third-person narration here, but sometimes it's first person, which we're going to talk about narrative stance in a second. But he gives us these very clear signposts so that as readers, we're not confused, even though, as I said, this is an incredibly broad collection of different voices that he is bringing together. So not only do we have the name Cyrus Shams, but we also have Katie University 2015. I would have said Katie University, except that I also listened to this book partly. I did my thing where I read some, listened some, read some, listened some, although I mostly read because I prefer that, and I really needed to read carefully because this book is so rich and so complicated. But they did in fact say Katie University. So before we move on, I want to quickly touch on the idea of the names in the book. Whenever we have a writer who is so gifted and where you understand that every single choice that Kaveh Akbar is making is very carefully thought through, obviously the names of these characters is going to be significant. So those of you who are here at the Fox page because you somehow want to read better or become a better reader, look up the names, figure out what the names mean. In this case, Ali means exalted or high, which is so excellent because in fact, when he comes to the United States, he is working in this chicken factory and in fact, has this very menial job and he works very, very long hours in a process that does not feel particularly, lofty. He talks about, the feces that are all over the chicken eggs and having to be careful, and also the limitations of what he talks about with his coworkers. I mean, you do not get the sense that this is someone whose life is particularly exalted. He's also someone who is a functioning alcoholic and someone who is violent and someone whose life is very difficult in many ways. I mean, his wife was vaporized by the United States in a jet just after his son was born, and he was left, in fact, to raise his son. So one quick interjection here is the fact that the 1979 revolution in Iran was really a very important turning point, and in many ways the United States and the British had a hand in it. We have a hand in a lot of what happens in the Middle East because of our oil interests and our dependency on oil. So for the Iranian people, for the Persian people, you have this real cutoff where you went from having, not necessarily like a great leader in the Shah of Iran, but then we have the Ayatollah Khomeini come in, and suddenly there's this really repressive, really vindictive, very totalitarian theocracy. So in many ways, something that happened when I was 10 years old was incredibly decisive in the lives of all Iranian immigrants, and I'm embarrassed to say that it's a chapter of our history that I do not know particularly well. Whenever we have the comments throughout the book about the responsibility of the United States, and of course the way that we shirked responsibility, it just was sort of sickening. I also I definitely remember the Iran hostage crisis. I mean, that was something, I think that's when we had like the yellow ribbons around the trees and everything. I was 10, 11 years old when that was going on. We were just coming off the bicentennial, which was like a real peak of patriotism. So, not 5 years later, we have 4 or 5 years later, we have this hostage crisis. But in fact, I was fairly ignorant beyond that about what was happening. And for someone like Ali Shams, who would have been born in the 70s, this is a hugely, hugely important piece of history. So back to the names. Ali means exalted or high. Roya means vision or dream, which is so significant because in many ways throughout this entire book, she is just a vision and she is just a dream. As far as history is concerned, she was vaporized in that plane, and it really does become sort of a vision for everybody. She is not an acting participant in the lives of her son and husband. Cyrus means son. S-U-N. So this is very important because, of course, it's also a homonym for son, S-O-N. So in many ways, he's both like this hugely powerful force. He's the actual sun, S-U-N, and is very central and is named that by his parents. But when we talk about it in English, it's also, a homonym for the idea of being someone's son. And in this case, it's complicated whose son he is. Really importantly, Shams also means son. So here we have this idea of Cyrus Shams as being, sun. So there's this emphasis on the idea of brightness and of choosing lightness over darkness. And there's also this idea of warmth, which is something that we see, in the earth throughout the book over and over. But of course, Cyrus Shams is someone who's, experiencing a lot of darkness in his life. So in some ways, Cyrus Shams, son, can be read as not ironic exactly, but just sort of a juxtaposition with how he feels about existence, and in fact, this kind of suicidal sadness that we hear him grappling with throughout the book. Interestingly, Kaveh means royal and Akbar means greatest. So, that Kaveh Akbar, it's not like this is a pen name that he chose. This was his name, that his parents gave to him. But it is interesting, to think about a young boy. He describes himself in the Midwest as really not fitting in, having these Coke bottle glasses, having buck teeth, feeling ugly. He thinks a lot about ugliness. So the idea of royal greatness as his name, it would have felt in some ways like not very fitting given his experience of being a child. I mean, I don't want to speak for him here, but in lots of ways, his own name is significant, just in terms of the grandeur of it. We're now going to dive into the text. So importantly, we have many voices in the novel, but we have a third-person narrator who is most of the time the source of everything that we know about Cyrus. It's interesting because we have first-person narrations from Roya and from Roya's brother Arash. We have a bunch of different first-person narrations. There's one from Z, but when we are hearing from Cyrus, except in his book that he begins to write, and we are reading excerpts as we go along, most of the time when we see him and we are sort of following along his story, it is a third-person omniscient narrator. It begins like this. Maybe it was that Cyrus had done the wrong drugs in the right order, or the right drugs in the wrong order. But when God finally spoke back to him after 27 years of silence, what Cyrus wanted more than anything else was a do-over. Clarification. Lying on his mattress that smelled like piss and Febreze, in his bedroom that smelled like piss and Febreze, Cyrus stared up at the single light bulb, willing it to blink again, willing God to confirm that the bulb's flicker had been a divine action and not just the old apartment's trashy wiring. This is such a bold beginning, and it's so important in terms of how it is focusing our attention. It's always so interesting in a book that is this good to finish it and then go back and look. So in the beginning, we have this preoccupation with God. We are seeing Cyrus at a very low ebb here. The idea of this piss and Febreze, I just even love the sound of that out loud. It's really speaking, in fact, to this very dark moment. Akbar talks at some point about having lived when he was doing a lot of drugs and drinking a lot in, an old house that was freezing cold that only had a mattress in it. So I think a lot of the passages on addiction, we are, it's somewhat understandable to think that these are coming from his autobiography. He talked at one point about how he is, in fact, many ways like Cyrus, but he also is in many ways like all of the other people. He described them as sock puppets, and that he's sort of using all of these different sock puppets to, in fact, express different experiences he's had and different thoughts. So here we have him at the beginning. This is 2015, and mercifully, he gets sober in the scope of the novel relatively quickly, but it is very important to see him at one of the many bottoms that he describes. So he wakes up, and what has happened here is he has asked for a sign from God, and he has gotten it. Interestingly, we are coming in after that happens. The reader is not, in fact, witness to that. He's not describing the light bulb flickering or his asking of God, and imploring God for a sign. But in fact, we're coming in a little after the action, and he's already doubting God and God's presence. So at the end of the book, we have him praying ardently. So God is something that is really important throughout. Kaveh Akbar has also spoken about a country that in many ways is hostile to people who look like him and people who pray like him. And he talks about being a Muslim man. So prayer seems very important to him in many ways. So this is not this is not an atheistic statement here. It is just one of ambiguity. And ambiguity in many ways is the name of the game right from the start and all the way through the end of the novel. So in addition to the sort of what is happening here, this idea of God making himself, wow, why him? I guess, that's a very Judeo-Christian thing that's been drilled into me over the decades. But this idea of a sign from God is kind of what is happening here. But the tone is equally important. Right from the start, we have a tone that is very specific and incredibly warm and welcoming. That in part is because of the casual nature of the language that's being used here. Things like the old apartment's trashy wiring, or even the flippancy of like having done the wrong drugs in the right order or the right drugs in the wrong order. The idea of being so free about confessing that he's doing a lot of drugs. There's a casual tone to this. There's a contemporary tone. We have a sense of this person as being a young man. He also says he's 27 years old. But we also have this confessional thing that's happening. So it's casual and contemporary, but it's also confessional. He's telling us right from the start, that this big moment has just happened for him. He's in very dire straits in terms of drug and alcohol use, and he's asked God for a sign and has gotten a sign, but is now doubting it. We also have this idea of humor right from the start. There's something, there's a levity to this. This is not, like a less than zero situation where we are meant to feel just like down and like there is, doomed and just like really despondent. We in fact see a lot of humor in this. So he has talked about how in the novel, heaviness is made dense by its awareness of joy and vice versa. So the silliness is made wise by having known real grief and terror. So there's this idea here of this very careful and very well wrought, I think, balance between, words that he's saying like silliness or joyfulness together with grief and terror. So right from the beginning, he's doing such an incredible job of straddling that line between a really dire situation and also one that to the reader seems funny. The mention of Febreze also feels very postmodern to me. It's a very postmodern thing to name products by their labels. There's lots of, in Infinite Jest, there's lots of like TM, there's all this sort of registered trademark stuff. And a lot is made of consumerism and late capitalism. And so this idea of Febreze here and the mention of it by name is a little bit of an echo right from the start, I would argue, of like a postmodern David Foster Wallace kind of approach. We've talked about the opening. Now we're going to move on to the narrative voice. So throughout the novel, it is really complex and incredibly important. So narrative voice is something we talk about a lot here at the Fox page because I think readers are often sort of unaware or at least haven't examined the narrative structure or the narrative approach. And in this case, it's extremely important because in fact, we have a lot of variety. Sometimes, you'll have a novel that's just omniscient third-person narrator the whole time, or you'll have one that's first person the whole time. And I'm very interested in ones where, different things are happening, and this is certainly an example of that. So in the beginning, we have this third-person narrator saying things like, maybe it was that Cyrus had done the wrong drugs in the right order or the right drugs in the wrong order. So that is a third-person omniscient narrator, but it is one that is fairly close to Cyrus's reality. It's someone who is in his brain. I mean, it's someone who is thinking his thoughts, the idea of what his room smells like, the idea of, this sign from God. So it's a very close third-person narrator in some ways. But then on page 40, things shift a little bit. So this is an important moment because, in fact, we have a place here, just like we had Katie or Katie University in the beginning, but we do not have a name. And I am not great about really focusing on chapter titles, but I didn't even notice that there was not a name here. But it is very significant that on page 40, on Sunday, the 3rd of July, 1988, in Bandar Abbas, Iran, that we have this nameless person who is taking off on a flight, in fact, that is about to be shot down by the United States. It begins like this. She'd never been on a plane before that day, had never had occasion to fly. Again, we have this third-person narrator, but it is one that also, in this case, is really diving deep into the mind of this woman who is on the flight. So I read those two parts, one, the third-person narration, the one that's relatively close to Cyrus, and then we looked at the one that was relatively close to the woman on the airplane in order to show that this third-person omniscient narrator is very nimble and really gets close to a lot of people. But then on page 84, we have Z Novak, so we have a name at the top, although we've had that before. We had Cyrus Shams at the beginning. This is also at Katie University, April 2014. So this is the year before we are seeing Cyrus lying on the mattress, seeing this sign from God. And it says this, early spring, that's when I first thought I might love him. That time of year when, in Indiana, each afternoon the sun came out to melt the previous night's snow. Curious buds poked their heads through the topsoil in the suspicious heat, only to be rebuked at night by hidden frosts. Z is a very important figure. He is someone who Cyrus loves deeply. He's someone who Cyrus has been sexually involved with off and on, forever. Someone who is very, very intimate, both sexually and also emotionally. They sleep together a lot, both in the sense of having sex together, but also just in the sense of being together. Z is an incredibly important character. It's really cool here to realize that what we are meant to associate him with at the very beginning is spring and is warmth. And it is important that at the very end of the novel, we will see a repeat of some of these motifs. But what's interesting in terms of the narrative perspective is that we are hearing Z's part of the story told in the first person. So he says, that's when I thought I might love him. And for me, it was the first time we'd seen the first person, and it was a bit of a shock, and I really liked it because, again, it feels very intimate to have someone telling you this information in the first person. We go on to see another first-person narration on page 118 when we have Arash Shirazi. This is in February of 1984 in Iran. I enlist because I have to enlist. So we're not going to read this too carefully, but we have this idea of him talking in the first person, which is extremely important because he has a large role. He, in many ways, is shown on the cover of the book. His job, and one that essentially kind of ruins his life because he is so shaken by it, is in fact to be this angel of death who is riding, through the fields of the dying men with a flashlight. You get the sense it's like a cheap battery operated flashlight under his face, and much is made in the art of the book, the visual art of the idea of this person as still being very young. This is someone who we see as a young kid at one point in the novel, and it's someone who is really arrested in many ways at this point when he is made to do this really heavy job when he is a relatively young man. On page 145, here we have another first-person narrator, and in this case it is Roya. So it's very important that we are hearing directly from Roya, who is Cyrus's mother. So in Tehran in August 1987, she says this: I never really loved being alive. It's hard to get there without some sort of distance. Hard to describe the shape of a cloud from inside the cloud. Like how I would appreciate gravity more if I'd had trouble floating off in my teens. And what I could sneak away from myself felt notable only in the contrast to that baseline of selflessness. A half hour stolen in the morning to quietly sip tea alone or mindlessly doodle only felt like a reprieve because it was what everything else, cooking, cleaning, shopping, wasn't. So this is a very important touch point, and honestly, I think we all need to go back and reread this book because this is so telling. We have this image of Roya as someone who is really constrained by domesticity right from the beginning here. We hear her talking about how much she would like freedom, which is a really important piece as her story evolves. The ways that, in fact, she is avoiding domesticity, which I'm not going to spoil for you, sort of how this occurs. But in some ways, I didn't fully understand it. And then I thought of this idea of the art monster, which I can't remember. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll put the name of the theorist who writes about this. But this art monster as, someone who will sacrifice everything for their art. And in the case of Roya, turning her back on domesticity in order to pursue something that's incredibly important to her. So you do get that sense throughout, and it's a very interesting perspective, this idea right at the beginning that what is freeing her is this doodling and this idea of sipping tea and essentially being by herself while she is still within the domestic sphere. So it's very important, again, that this is one of these first-person narrations because it really does help us understand her motivations for everything that ensues. The last thing that we are going to look at here in terms of narrative voice is this time that really struck me. This is yet another testament to how incredibly complex and how incredibly rich this book is. So this is in a section where we have this third-person omniscient narrator. It's largely telling us Cyrus's story, but then we have this moment when Orchidée, I looked up how to pronounce that, and actually in an interview, Kaveh Akbar says both Orchidée and Orchidée. So Orchidée is what they tell you when you look it up on, how do I pronounce this name? It is a Persian name for a girl, and apparently it's very common, and it means orchid. And orchid is so interesting. I mean, that's a very kind of weirdly, like, it's a very sexualized flower in some ways. It's both sort of vaginal and also has like that pistil or stamen or whatever it is. And they're unusual, and they're expensive. They're kind of a luxury item, and they only grow in very particular circumstances. So all of this, I think, is inflecting the way that we should be thinking about her as a type of orchid. So I'm going to read the paragraph right before, because you want to have this sense of their conversation. So she and Cyrus are having the conversation, and it is told from the perspective of this third-person omniscient narrator. My mother died when I was very young. My father never really got over it. I feel like in a lot of ways he blamed himself. Maybe he even blamed me. I think my being around made it hard for him. Orchide winced, studying Cyrus. He was a handsome young man, strong jaw, high, thick eyebrows. The Persian word for eyebrow literally deconstructs to cloud above. Cyrus's made his eyes look pained, stormy, even when he was laughing, much older and darker than the rest of his face. So many Iranian men she had known had eyes like that. Her breathing tubes were fogging up a little more than before. So you have this sense of her as really seeing him. And what's interesting here is we are all of a sudden in her perspective. So this idea when she says, he was a handsome man, strong jaw, high, thick eyebrows. And then, so this is from her perspective, and it's a departure. This third-person narrator is essentially, without saying I, is essentially moving into sort of a first-person narration that's very specifically from Orchide's perspective in a way that departs from the rest of the Cyrus sections. And it was so... it was so kind of revelatory for me. It's the one time that we see something really strongly from her perspective, and it's really important that it happens within a Cyrus part, even though the reader has access to it in a way that Cyrus does not. So Cyrus has talked before about all of these different about ugliness and about what Persian men look like. His father says that someone is Persian because in fact they're ugly, which that led to a lot of thinking. Apparently that actually did happen in Kaveh Akbar's life. So he did a lot of thinking about what his father meant by that. And one of the conclusions he came to, actually, I found this so beautiful, is the idea that people who have experienced a lot of grief and a lot of terror, that you can see those things in their faces. So this idea of what's happening here in these eyes, and the idea of these sad eyes that she is seeing on this young man, I mean, this is someone who has experienced, Cyrus, that is, someone who's experienced an incredible amount of difficulty. He doesn't have a mother, his father is alcoholic, is sometimes violent. He's dislocated in the sense that he is Iranian American. He's living in America from the time he's 2 years old, but would essentially see himself always as different. At one point, he talks about the double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois talks about. So much like an African American person, because he is visually different from most of his counterparts, most of his peers in the Midwest, there is a lot that goes into the idea of his face. And so this idea here of Orchide as seeing that is so incredibly powerful, and also seeing this sadness that really does inflect him in many different ways, not just in terms of his own life and his own tragedies, but in fact generations of tragedies. We're going to move on from the narrative stance to talk about the structure of the book. I've mentioned that it has this kind of multiplicity of different texts that are all kind of braided together, and this multiplicity of narrations. Because of the way that it is structured, it begins in 2015, we jump to 2017, we jump back to 1985, we jump to 1988. That jumping around in time is incredibly important in terms of the structure. And one of the stories that comes from the childhood of Arash and Roya is obviously, it's told, in fact, I believe from 1985, but it is about something that happened when they were children. So it's going way back in time, not way back, but it's going back in time, to the childhood of all of these adults. But we also have this incredible, and hugely impactful inclusion of these different texts and different sort of ephemera. So I really was impacted, as I mentioned, by the inclusion, and it's very brief and there is no commentary about it, of all of these kind of press releases about the shooting down of this jet. So I think it is so genius of Kaveh Akbar to include this with, it's separately, it's outside of the text. It sort of provides this foundation upon upon which the whole entire story rests, and it is so telling. I want to go through, I think most of you maybe have finished the book. This is not giving anything away, and in fact, the last example of this is only sort of halfway through the book. It really gives nothing away, but it is startling to go back and read these things in succession. So we have them almost as these memos, which is also a very important and intimate thing. This is not just a press release that we are reading. These are things that, it appears like an intimate, or not intimate, but it appears like a private message between, these important people in the American government. So on page 20, we have this. From Rear Admiral William M. Fogarty, USN. That's the Navy. To Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Central Command. I mean, Commander-in-Chief, you assume that's the president, right? I mean, yikes. And then the subject, all in caps, it looks like someone's screaming. It says this: formal investigation into the circumstances surrounding the downing of a commercial airliner by the USS Vincennes, CG-49, on 3 July 1988, U. I don't know what the parentheses U is. And then number 4, there's a Roman numeral 4, opinions. A, general. So this is a general opinion, which, really means like everyone's opinion. Number 1, the USS Vincennes did not purposefully shoot down an Iranian commercial airliner. So the idea of a commercial airliner is like such a crazy euphemism in some ways. I mean, it is that, but like what that means is one that is carrying civilians. And in this case, over 200 people were killed, and maybe even closer to 300, and something like 66 of them were children. So this is this horrific thing that has happened. And what he's doing here is presenting it. I mean, we have a very in-depth look at it in other circumstances, and it really, in many ways, is the foundation of the entire plot of the book. But the way that we have these excerpts just standing alone is so powerful. The next one is on page 46. Washington, July 3rd. A United States Navy warship in the Persian Gulf shot down an Iranian passenger plane today that the Navy said it mistook for a jet fighter, and Iran said all 290 people on board were killed. So this came from something called Action is Defended in the New York Times, July 4th, 1988. I mean, it's really significant too, 4th of July. I mean, it's really just like horrific in many ways. So again, there's all sorts of like, not quite obfuscation, but there's all sorts of like passing of the buck here, that the Navy said it mistook for a jet fighter. I don't know a lot about this, but a 300-person passenger plane, in my opinion, would look very little like a jet fighter. I mean, I think this information is coming from like Top Gun or something, but it does seem, in fact, like a major crime occurred here, and somebody was responsible for doing something that was egregious, and no one will take responsibility. Then it says, and Iran said all 290 people on board were killed. I mean, that is so crazy. Like to say Iran said that when in fact, I mean, it's a fact. I mean, I guess you would have to rely on what Iran was saying in terms of like, the number of people on board. But this idea of Iran said and the US said, you're getting into these questions of interpretation and who said what and who has the actual truth, which is really painful in a situation that is so grotesque and tragic and terrible. Then we have on page 168, I believe this is last of these kind of pulled out verbatim reports on the part of the government. This is also from Rear Admiral William M. Fogarty from the USN, and then it is also to the Commander-in-Chief. And then number 1 in the intelligence background, A, it says the Gulf War. And then the next line under that in this outline form says this: the war between Iran and Iraq is the latest iteration of a conflict dating back 1,000 years. So this is so important. I mean, this, like a short sentence like that, is so impactful because Kaveh Akbar is so good. But this idea here of the American perspective is that Iran and Iraq have been fighting. This is an iteration of a war that has been going on for 1,000 years. The United States being a very, very new country in contrast to that is significant. But this idea here too of us being involved in something that feels significant to us when we have, I think, very, very little understanding of what is happening in this situation. And it also goes back to this idea of this kind of the grief and the terror that we see on the faces of some Persian men, because in fact they have been in a state of some sort of conflict for the last 1,000 years. So it's just such a beautifully efficient and really powerful way to provide this incredibly important foundation upon which I would argue the rest of the novel rests. So not only do we have these memos, we also have lots of other texts. We have a lot of poetry throughout the entire book. And a lot of it is written, in fact, some of it is Persian poets, but a lot of it, in fact, is written by Cyrus Shams. So on page 97, we see the first of these poems, and I think pretty sure it's the first of these poems. And it is about Bobby Sands. So Bobby Sands is an Irish guy who in 1981 did a hunger strike because of the very complicated conflict in Ireland, but died a martyr. So died as someone who was standing for his cause. It's really embarrassing and terrible that I actually don't know exactly what it was. I would imagine maybe it has to do with Irish independence from England. Wait, no, they had already established independence. So it must have had to do with the conflict with the Troubles, the conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics. But you have this beginning that is so powerful on the part of Cyrus Shams. It says this: "There's a Bobby Sands street in Tehran, 1 block over from Ferdowsi Avenue." So we have this idea of Bobby Sands, of this martyr, as being really, recognized really very clearly with this street name in Tehran. So, and Kaveh Akbar talks a lot about the raising up of martyrs and how it's really, really very much a part of being an Iranian man, an Iranian person, this idea of having huge esteem for people who die as martyrs, usually religious martyrs. He talks about earth martyrs and people who are martyrs for land or justice or dignity or family or art. So when he is talking about martyrdom, it's really a more broad idea than just, a religious martyr. And Bobby Sands is a very good example of that. On page 73, so 20 pages before this, 25 pages before this, we have mention of Bobby Sands, and we have this idea of all of these martyrs being pasted up on the wall. But here we have a poem dedicated to him, and that, of course, is part of the Book of Martyrs that Cyrus Shams is writing. So it is Book of Martyrs, altogether capitalized, .docx. So the idea that this is this thing that is being written on the computer should lead you to ask, okay, when is it that Cyrus is writing this? Is this something that Cyrus is writing before he goes to New York to meet the artist? Or is this something that we should imagine, or could imagine, is happening after the scope of the novel? So after, the novel closes, which is, again, another reason why I think I need to go back and reread the entire novel, because the answer to that is not totally clear to me. But I love the fact too that it's like it's a docx, which I can't remember. It's like not a Google Doc, I don't think. Maybe that's a Google Doc. I can't remember. But this idea of this being this kind of thing that he is working on, and also like the very specific moment in time and the very specific like computer platform that he is using is all inherent in this idea of this being a document that is this changing living document. In fact, the next time that we see the Book of Martyrs .docx by Cyrus Shams, we have essentially what is an explanation, and it is this: "I am setting out to write a book of elegies for people I've never met. Yes, there is an unforgivable hubris in my imagining any part of their living and presuming to write about it. There is also hubris in writing about anything else." I mean, as with anything in this novel, this is so resonant and so important. So it's so excellent, too, the way that this is set up. We have on page 106 by itself this idea of, sort of the genesis and the reason behind this book that he is going to write, the Book of Martyrs. And then right away, the next section is Ali Shams, or Shams. I don't know if it's Shams or Shams. Also, speaking of names, Shams, I mean, in English, a sham is like a fake, somebody who's not authentic. So there are all sorts of different resonances of these names. But so we have this idea of writing about people that he doesn't know at all, about lives he cannot imagine, and this idea of martyrdom. And then right across the page, we have the beginning of Ali Shams's chapter that reads this. The chicken farm where I worked in Fort Wayne wasn't a normal farm. We didn't raise chickens for you to eat. We raised the grandparents of the chickens you eat. So this is so powerful. First of all, we have a first-person narration, but it is like using this direct address to say you. So it's implicating the reader in this very powerful way. You have this idea here of somehow being implicated both in the fact, that this is someone in the United States who's having to work this menial job as a chicken farmer in order to make ends meet, and a job that he works very hard and, sort of 6 days a week. And it's really in many ways causing his life to be very, very difficult. But you also have this idea here, the fact that he's making the grandparents of the chickens that we eat. You really have this idea of intergenerational stuff. You have this idea of the father creating these grandparents. You have the idea of, what do we owe past generations? What do we owe future generations? But just the words, the chicken farm where I worked in Fort Wayne, it's like you have this sense of this very Midwestern. I love the inclusion of Fort Wayne, not Indiana, or not the Midwest. It's very specific in order to feel very broad. If you hear, as the reader, you hear Fort Wayne, you can picture lots and lots of cities all through the Midwest. If someone said the Midwest, it would be much harder in some ways because it would be much more general. It would be hard to imagine, on any sort of granular scale. The last thing I'd like to talk about in terms of structure is this idea of this interlude. So on page 188, we have what is it reads very much like a fairy tale, and it is a total departure from the other types of narrators that we've seen. This is not the omniscient third that tells us about Cyrus, and it's not one of these first-person narrators, and it's certainly not a memo, that was pulled from some government document in the United States. In fact, it begins this way. It says interlude, which also is cluing us into the fact that this is a different thing. It's also, it should be alerting us to the fact that this is very important. I personally have not done enough thinking about this interlude, but I've done some thinking about it. So it says this. Once there was, and how much there was. So that opening sentence is very difficult to read. I mean, it's playing with this idea of like once upon a time, but this idea of just the idea of being, it's a very complicated thing. It actually took me several times to read it. Again, I'm going to read it and then I'll go on. Once there was, and how much there was. In the land of Tus, there was a young boy named Ferdowsi. Ferdowsi was an adventurous child loving to play outside in the wind and green. Ferdowsi is a very important Persian poet, and in fact, during an interview, Kaveh Akbar said that in every Iranian home, there are two books. There's the Quran, and then there is a collection of work by Ferdowsi, and only one of them is ever read, which I'll leave you to that. But you have this idea here of Ferdowsi as being this poet in the interlude as well, but there's a lot of sort of delayed gratification. I mean, in many ways, I think that is partially what this is about. He, in fact, doesn't finish the poem, and it's up to his daughter to go and sort of collect the payment from this poem that he is meant to write. So I should, again, think further about this, but honestly, I could spend an entire semester teaching this in a graduate school level course. We don't have time to dig into every single piece, but what I want to bring up is this idea of structurally that we have all of these different elements. It's important to ask the question, so what? Why is it that we have all of these different elements? What is it doing? And I would argue that what Akbar is trying to do here is about communicating a reality that is incredibly complex. I mean, this is a book that is tackling addiction and love and immigration and nationality and martyrdom and religion. I mean, it's like these huge topics. And so the idea of moving toward all of those different topics and developing them, not to mention developing all of the characters and the plot and all of these different breadcrumbs to make sense of the ending of the book, all of those different things are very well served, very well developed by having this multiplicity of elements that are all braided together. So Kaveh Akbar, in several different things, he has talked about different things being a braid, shame being a braid of self-loathing, or I'm making that up. He didn't say that. But I love this visual image of the braid. It's very poetic. He's a poet, so he would think in those terms. But in many ways, this is a book. It's a novel that is being braided together in a very intricate way from all of these different elements. And it's meant to sort of give us a lot of different angles so that we can piece together something that is inherently incredibly complicated. I want to talk in a slightly different way about another element of the structure, but it's also this incredible inventiveness that I think puts it in its kind of own category. What I'm referring to here are those chapters of the book where Cyrus is imagining a conversation between a very well-known character of some sort, either a real person like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, or even someone like Lisa Simpson, who is a cartoon character, or, a mystic Sufi poet like Rumi. And you have them in conversation with a character from the book who is very important. Cyrus is someone who battles a lot of insomnia, and he mentions at some point that one of the ways that he falls asleep is by beginning to imagine these conversations. So what I liked about that kind of allusion to this kind of imagining in the conversations is, in my mind, when I looked at these conversations, like I believe the first one is Lisa Simpson and Roya Shams, I wasn't reading them as a dream sequence. So I'm always suspicious of a dream sequence. The old adage is like, tell a dream, lose a reader. And I am a little bit like that. And Akbar has spoken very eloquently about the fact that he loves listening to people's dreams, but that when he looked at how to best present, like how to most engagingly present a dream, the secret is to not have it just be weird, first of all, and also to not have it just be about, learning more about the character who's dreaming. It really has to be something that has impact on the plot. So in each one of these circumstances, when we have these invented conversations, it really is telling us more than just what we are seeing. So it's either, in some cases, it's developing a character that we don't know much else about. So it's not just the main character telling us a dream. It is, in fact, a conversation that is very revealing of someone who we need to know more about. Akbar also has said that there are lots of different images that come up in these dreams that are sort of like little breadcrumbs. So he's developing strands of the plot through them. He's also answering questions in different ways. It also is doing a very important thing for the tone. So the book is really, really funny. We haven't talked enough about that. I mean, it is so smart in terms of its humor. Like, the humor is so intelligent, but it's also so warm and so funny and so unassuming and sort of casual and grounded. So the idea of Lisa Simpson having a conversation with Cyrus's mom is absolute genius in the sense that it is giving a certain tone. It's adding to the kind of joyful nature, the levity of this novel that in many ways is very heavy. So I want to look at one specific time on page 162. I loved this because this is a conversation between the imaginary brother that Cyrus imagines he has. It's so funny that his name is Beethoven Shams. So you have the conversation between Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Beethoven's Shams, which is funny just from the start. You're like, who's Beethoven Shams? And then it turns out, in fact, that this, imaginary brother, which lots of kids when they're young have an imaginary friend. It's particularly poignant that, in fact, this only child who lost his mother when he was only months old is making up a brother, making up more family for himself. It also just killed me that Beethoven Shams is not, in fact, named after the composer. Beethoven Shams is, in fact, named after the dog in the Disney film. But I believe it is also Beethoven who writes that very important piece of music that is in Arash's car, the Miserere. So that's something that is really tied to the idea of death, and that is one of these things that comes up over and over again. It's a piece of music that comes up in very important different junctures in the novel. So I would think that we should all assume that Beethoven Shams is a funny reference to a Disney movie or whoever made that movie, but also it is helping us to understand that his family is undergirded and that he is, on some level of his consciousness has sort of absorbed this really, really heartrending piece of music that is so important to his uncle, whose job it was in the army to play the angel of death. On 162, we have this hilarious exchange between Beethoven and Kareem. "What do you love?" Kareem repeated. "Basketball, I guess," Beethoven answered. The two men were circling the parking lot, walking the square brick edges and turning right at sharp angles. The trees nodded along. Borges, pecans, magic tricks, Twin Peaks probably. Both men laughed. Twin Peaks? Kareem asked, scrunching up his face. Wow. So you're one of those dudes. You drink IPAs too? You like hiking on the weekends? Beethoven smiled. I mean, probably something insufferable like that, right? Maybe I'm really into turning people onto Infinite Jest, or CrossFit, or Tesla. So I love this in part because it is so irreverent and so funny in lots of ways, but also I love this inclusion of Infinite Jest. So in many ways, to me, that is Kaveh Akbar saying, like, yes, turning people on to Infinite Jest is insufferable. It's like, Tesla and, drinking IPAs. So there's this idea of sort of understanding that it's a bit cliche, but it also is speaking, to a person, in this case, Beethoven, who, I think you can also envision Beethoven as an extension of Cyrus himself. Your baby brother or your younger brother, who you imagine is obviously going to be an extension of your own ego and your own consciousness. So in many ways, this is an extension of Cyrus who is saying this. And it's really moving because what he is saying, in fact, is he's trying to communicate himself to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, like really trying to get himself across in ways that add to the levity, but also acknowledge this sort of somewhat of a debt that I keep reading into the novel where David Foster Wallace is concerned. We are going to dip a little bit further into the idea of David Foster Wallace here. So I want to talk about the ways that the two things are similar. But before we do that, I just want to underscore the point that David Foster Wallace was someone who was plagued by just really, really difficult mental health issues. He committed suicide in 2008 and really had struggled a lot. In Infinite Jest, there is an enormous amount about sobriety. And I don't think he ever, said that he was sober. And in fact, there was some sort of stuff when he wrote that book about how he would go to these open meetings, and that's how he knows all of these different stories. But I find it sort of hard to believe that he didn't have certain experiences with, at least, with sort of near addiction, just because the writing about it in Infinite Jest is so excellent. I mean, that's kind of blasphemy because you don't have to have experienced something in order to write about it well. But I don't know. I just have that idea. So there are a couple of other things. One is that in David Foster Wallace, in Infinite Jest in particular, which that's the book that this reminds me of, you do have different narrators in much the same way that you have here, and you even have these sort of subtitles of chapters that sort of look almost like this and appeal like this. You also have dates throughout. In David Foster Wallace, it takes place in the future in a land that is so late stage capitalism that in fact each year is now owned by a corporation. So you have the year of the Depends adult undergarment, that sort of thing, or the year of the Whopper. So you have this kind of dystopian future that is being envisioned in that, but you have the same idea of sort of moving through time in interesting ways. There's also an incredible inventiveness. David Foster Wallace is imagining a world where the Canadian separatists, a big chunk of the United States has separated, and it's a very different sort of political and geopolitical situation than we have right now. And you see some of that inventiveness here just in the concept of the plot and how intricate and how important a lot of the different sort of nuances are. We also have, there's some similarities of tone. So both are just incredibly intelligent. You have this sort of intellectual bent that's not too overbearing. David Foster Wallace, I think, falls prey to that. Kaveh Akbar does not. I mean, this has all of the joys, in my mind, of something that's really brainy, like a lot of David Foster Wallace's work, but there's much more heart here. There is a cynicism that is lacking in this work. And in fact, at the end, the two men, Z and Cyrus, talk about how cynicism is not in the best of works. And in fact, I think this book, there's some cynicism, but not a ton. There's also a certain irreverence and some certain postmodern things like, talking about Febreze or all of these different things. So in addition to talking about addiction, both of them talk a lot about hope. Don Gately is, I think, a really heroic character in Infinite Jest, and you see elements of his warmth, certainly in Z, who is also kind of an important player. You have absent parents, you have siblings, and you have the focus on young men and young men who are addicted in both cases, and dealing, with their own sobriety. One of the ways that I see them most clearly is when Kaveh Akbar talks about the old timers in his sobriety program. The omniscient narrator on page 21 says this: That evening, Cyrus drove himself to an AA meeting at the Camp 5 Center, Katie's local recovery clubhouse. It was a converted craftsman home, gabled roof, rickety wooden frame painted dingy lavender, a fixture of crusty old-timers chain-smoked perpetually in the parking lot, while embarrassed kids with court cards avoided eye contact as they shuffled in and out on the hours. So this idea of a home, there's a halfway house in Infinite Jest that seems a lot like this. It's outside of Boston. And you have that same group of old-timers, kind of crusty old-timers in David Foster Wallace's work. They're known as the Crocodiles, and they're like they're motorcycle riding kind of people. But you have this wisdom and this humility and this real sort of importance placed on these old-timers. In Infinite Jest, they talk about how those people have geologic amounts of sobriety. So you have this idea of these people as really personifying hope. So these are people whose lives have been really insufferable in lots of ways, and yet they're managing to stay sober. So in some ways, I think we are meant to see Gabe as sort of a Don Gately character. And when he does make contact with Cyrus and he's checking in to make sure he's still sober, their communications are sort of anemic. It's not like they're really engaging, but you do have this sense of the possibility of remaining sober that is, personified by Gabe, and also the idea of genuine connection that is really important, that I think is, very, very much constant in a lot of David Foster Wallace's work, and also is very important here with Kaveh Akbar. Because sobriety is so foundational in the book, and also for Kaveh Akbar, he talks pretty openly about how exhausting it is, in fact, to stay sober, and how difficult it was to get sober in the first place, and in many ways how poetry and how language, really sort of saved him. So I want to look at a couple of examples of when he is talking about addiction and sobriety, just because I think he does it so incredibly well. I think it's sort of a tricky thing to do because it can end up feeling preachy or kind of maudlin, and it is so well done here. So before we get into the quotations, there is a quotation that was pulled in two different articles that I read. These were not super long reviews, but they pulled the same quotation in order just to talk about how beautiful his writing is. The quotation from the book is this: "Beautiful, terrible, how sobriety disabuses you of the sense of your having been a gloriously misunderstood scumbag prince shuffling between this or that narcotic crown." So part of the reason that I want to bring this up is not only because it's excellent writing, but also because this is the prose of a poet. So again and again and again, there are incredible examples of figurative language. A lot of poetry is about, not exclusively, but a lot of poetry is about seeing things in a different way. So it would be, making a metaphor or something symbolic, really seeing something, in a way that expands beyond just the vision of the thing. So in this case, the idea of this scumbag prince who is shuffling between narcotic crowns, it's such an incredible evocation of what it would be like, and this idea of being disabused of that, it just is such a good distillation of the sort of humility that someone has to bring to sobriety, and the sort of resistance to that, these sort of ideas of grandeur. So I'm not at all surprised that I'm a little surprised that two different people quoted the exact same thing, because frankly, this book is an embarrassment of riches. There's so many examples of just incredible writing. But I loved that as a distillation of sobriety. But I also want to read on pages 23 and 24. This is an excerpt of when Cyrus is at an AA meeting. And as I'm reading this, think about all of the ways that this is working. So it's an incredible depiction of sobriety. We're talking here about the Midwest and what it's like to be an Iranian American in the Midwest. We're talking about words and the idea of how both how flimsy they are, but how they are also sort of the only thing that we have. This is Cyrus speaking in the meeting. "If I'm being rigorously honest, I still think most of you are fucking idiots. If we met outside these rooms, you'd probably try to deport me." "Outside issue," barked Big Susan, a tiny but gruff old-timer who, despite her nickname, actually stood under 5 feet. "Non-AA related." Her voice made everyone in the room sit up a little straighter. "See, that's what I mean," Cyrus said, holding up his hands at Big Susan. Recovery is made of words, and words have all these rules. How can anything so limited touch something as big as whatever the fuck a higher power is? How can it get rid of the big ball of rot inside me? It feels like this giant sponge sucking away anything in the world that's supposed to feel good. What words can touch that? Exasperated, Cyrus snorted at himself. I don't know, I'm sorry. It's so touching and it's also funny. Like it's just such an incredible amalgamation of wisdom and perception and intuition and humor. It's just incredible. Then on the next page, he's actually talking to Gabe, and there's another thing that gets quoted a lot in the reviews of the book. So they're at a diner afterward, and Gabe says this: "Okay, God made of words, you're sad, keep going." He took a sip of his espresso, which left a little moon of foam at the edge of his white mustache. That's it, really. The big, pathological sad. Whether I'm actually thinking about it or not, it's like a giant bowling ball on the bed. Everything kind of rolls into it. So it's such a beautiful simile. Like this idea of the big pathological sad, that actually also to me sounds like a David Foster Wallace thing a little bit. But you have this idea of that as a bowling ball, which already, he talked about the ball of rot inside him the page before, and then it's now this bowling ball. So we have this idea of a bowling ball of sadness, but then the idea of it being on a bed, being sort of externalized, but then everything rolling toward it is just so powerful. It's inventive and interesting and clear, but also just like so articulate for something that is very difficult to articulate. The thing I'm not even talking about here, which is the subtext of all of this, is that this is Cyrus talking about the higher power and talking about God and what God wants for him. So you have this sense of this preoccupation with God and with spirituality throughout the entire book in a way that I probably have not given quite enough attention to. And then I want to finish up this little chunk on addiction and sobriety just at the very end of the book. So that happens relatively early in the book. His kind of breakdown at his AA meeting. It's not a breakdown. It's like, he's communicating his difficulties, and then he has a little bit of a falling out with Gabe. And then at the very end of the book, so that was at the beginning, and then at the end, we have another expression of how difficult sobriety is. So it's very important. This is not a book of it's difficult in the beginning and by the end, everything's fine. That's not the way that addiction works for a lot of people. So on page 270, we have this. Normal people think of recovery as a kind of abstinence. They imagine us sitting around white-knuckled, sweating as we count out hours, trying desperately to distract ourselves enough not to relapse. This is because for normal people, drinking is an activity, like brushing their teeth or watching TV. They can reasonably imagine excising drinking, like any other activity, without collapsing their entire person. For a drunk, there's nothing but drink. So it's so powerful. He also goes on to say, this was something that he talks about in interviews as well, just about how when he was using drugs and drinking a lot, there was nothing else in his life. He says this in As Cyrus on page 271. There was nothing in my life that wasn't predicated on getting drunk, either getting fucked up itself or getting money to get fucked up by working, or slinging this drug for that drug or that drug for cash. Getting sober means having to figure out how to spend 24 hours a day. It means building an entirely new personality, learning how to move your face, your fingers. It meant learning how to eat, how to speak among people and walk and fuck, and worse than any of that, learning how to just sit still. So what's very important here, and I want to make very clear, again, this is page 271, and all of that is coming from this book of Martyrs, .docx. So what I want to make the point here of, though, is that this idea of sobriety, like simply staying sober, is a type of meaning in life. So when we think of martyrs and the idea of martyrdom as simply meaning that your life means something because of the way you die, or that your death means something, I think there's a way that we can interpret, being sober as a type of martyrdom, not in a negative way, but the sense that eventually all sober people are going to die. And much is made in the book of the idea that, sober people, in fact, there are a couple of different people like this, they get to sort of live extra years. They were supposed to die at some point because of their drug use or alcoholism. And then all the years after that are sort of, essentially they're sort of bonus years. So this idea of martyrdom in some ways really can be read, I think, as kind of an extension of sobriety, or that sobriety, you really are sort of this long-term martyr in the best of ways, because simply staying sober is so, so difficult. And when you finally do die, you've sort of survived your death that was whatever bottom or whatever it was that made you stop drinking. And then when you do finally die, again, I think you can read sobriety as a type of martyrdom in the very best sense of that word. I mentioned at the beginning that we were going to talk about this kind of faith in / preoccupation with language. But I think that we've covered so many elements that have to do with language that I'm not sure that we need to dive any deeper. But I do want to just summarize all of the different ways in which Kaveh Akbar is leaning really heavily into language as this incredible medium. I mean, this book is very concerned with the idea of art and the idea of immortality and the idea of words and poetry as providing immortality, which itself is, a type of kind of martyrdom. It means that someone's death is worth something because they leave behind, an incredible piece of art. So in this book, we have the title, which is, this use of language is so inventive with this exclamation mark. It's so complicated and so telling and so genius in so many ways. We have all of this different poetry that is sort of intertwined in the book, some of it by Cyrus, which is, obviously being made up by Kaveh Akbar, but you have all of these other poets too. So you have this idea of poetry as being, the sort of most rich distillation of language. It's when language is working hardest. And it's also in some ways, the poets in lots of ways are the people who have become immortal. Those of you on YouTube can see that right in this corner here, I have a little needle point that I made of Sappho. And for those of you on the YouTube, I'm going to play for you a little time lapse of my creation of this Sappho. But what I love about this is this is this poet from around 0 BCE. I actually don't know. She might be pre-BCE, before the Common Era. I'm not really sure. But she's ancient. She's very, very old. We only have fragments. And yet she is someone who is so inspirational to so many people. We have reams and reams of scholarship on her. Her work is incredibly important. And all we have of it are fractured pieces. But what I like here, too, is that I just traced that image from an image that I liked. It was a drawing that someone had done. I traced it. I needle pointed it. I made it into this piece of art that, frankly, I really love and I'm very proud of. But what this is for Sappho is a type of immortality. And I don't think we can call her a martyr, but we have this idea of words as providing immortality, which is extremely important in terms of all the different themes in the book. So we have poetry. We also have figurative language. The power of words to explain and to communicate in this book is unbelievable. It's so rich in terms of explaining things, in ways that are very oblique and very orthogonal, but also are just incredibly clear, in large part because the figurative language is so strong. Then we have all of those inventive conversations, but mostly. And then at the end, things get very sort of wild and very sort of, psychedelic in some ways, where language, I think, is being tested in lots of different regards. But what I would say is that the levity and the humor and the warmth in this book is so incredibly impressive to me. So that seems like a good place to end. Those of you who are interested in what happens at the end of this book should tune in to hear the second installment of this lecture, where we will talk about the ending of the book. But thank you so much for tuning in. Kaveh Akbar's Martyr was so moving for me. It feels like such an important book. If I go back and reread it and come up with a bunch of other stuff to say, which is entirely possible, I will get back to you. But thank you very much for tuning in. I hope this made your experience of the book even deeper and even more profound. So, happy reading.